think we're all set. Okay, great. Good. Well, with that, I would like to introduce myself to everyone. My name is Uwe Brandis. I'm a member of the faculty at Georgetown University. I am the chair of the Urban Planning Department. And in addition to that, I am the faculty director of the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. And it's my great honor and pleasure to function as the Master of Ceremonies for this webinar. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us. This webinar tonight is truly in the spirit of the Global Cities Initiative, with so many people joining from all over the world in this incredible digital platform that brings us together. We have an amazing set of presentations tonight, and as I'm sure everybody has seen, we have an agenda that is posted to the Georgetown Global Cities website. And if anyone doesn't have that, I will just say it's the URL is global cities, one word, globalcities.georgetown.edu. And under the events tab, you will see the agenda for tonight's meeting. I would like to share with everyone that this session is being recorded, and we will post this to the website in the coming days. And in addition to that, I would like to just really welcome and express my great gratitude to Michael Pante, who joins us from Manila and is at the Ateneo de Manila University. We had originally intended to convene this research forum in person in Manila, and of course we are not doing that. We're convening digitally. But what I would like to do is hand it over to Michael to just welcome us to this event.
Hi, thanks Uwe. And welcome everyone. On behalf of the Department of History of Ateneo de Manila University, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. It's a pleasure, and at the same time, it also pains me that we can't meet in person, as already said by Uwe. I would have wanted to bring you to the different places which show the different facets of urbanization in Metro Manila, in Manila, Quezon City, and the other nearby cities. I would also like to mention that the university, Ateneo de Manila University, is looking toward building a more robust research network, literature, oriented towards urban issues. We have a research center at Ateneo, Institute of Philippine Culture, which has a long tradition of engaging with urban communities. Our department also has a strong faculty on geared towards urban issues. And we are delighted, the whole university, not just the Department of History, the whole university is delighted to be part of this webinar. So Uwe?
Thank you, Michael. It's our great pleasure, as always, to partner together. I would like to just reflect for a small minute on the particularly unique and challenging times that we find ourselves in. For many of you that are not in the United States that are joining this meeting, we are also in the United States in the midst of this incredible pandemic. The pandemic in the United States has triggered an incredible economic impact that has impacted many, many people in all of society. but many people, especially in cities. And as many of you know from following the news, we are living through a moment in the United States where the issues of race and class within cities are being made visible in ways that are very immediate. And as a point of departure for this meeting tonight, and for many of the discussions and other research initiatives being undertaken by the Global Cities Initiative, I would like to just formally say that as the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative, we stand in solidarity with all people seeking to advance a more just, equal, and inclusive city. And again, I'd like to just welcome everyone again to this session. Before we start with the first presentation, I would like to invite Professor Jordan Sand to offer some reflections on the Asian Cities Urban Settlers Initiative. Jordan.
Thank you, Uwe. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning. It's a real thrill for me to be here together with my colleagues from all over. This is actually the third of 3 days. We had small meetings together the past couple of days to talk about our work, and it's been a very gratifying period. As you know, this project is called Asian Cities and Urban Settlers, and I thought I'd just say a word about how it got started. This is an ongoing project, and it involves people teaching and researching in cities around East and Southeast Asia. And we're all, we're all seeking to re-examine urban settlement, so-called informal and marginal settlements in particular, at the grassroots level. And it started because, well, I should say I'm a historian of Japan, particularly of the city of Tokyo. And a couple of years ago, I was researching in Tokyo, and I had the opportunity to travel to 6 cities around Southeast Asia, all of which were new to me. And together with some of today's participants, we visited informal settlers in these cities and asked them about their lives and about their settlements. And everyone we spoke to, even just casually, sort of dropping in and meeting people on the street, everyone we spoke to was open and articulate and had lots to say and had really fresh perspectives on their own cities of the sort that I had not encountered in the very large scholarship on urban informality. And I think the scholarship on informal settlements tends to focus on the informality, on policy, rights, economics. These are all terribly important issues, rather more than it does on the settlers themselves often. And so rather than informality, we have decided to focus on how people settle in cities, how they make parts of the city their own, sometimes how they are unsettled, to use a phrase that Erik will be using, get displaced and resettle. And a key component of this was to think both of cities as a whole and comparatively, and to try and learn from the settlers themselves, hence Asian Cities and Urban Settlers. So 6 of us met a while ago now at Georgetown, and the papers from that earlier workshop will be appearing soon in the journal City and Society. Let me advertise that. And so today's presentations will be from the 6 of us who are publishing together soon, beginning with Uji Nugroho of Gajah Mada University, Yogyakarta, and then Seng Lo, independent researcher in Singapore, also teaching University of Western Australia, then Erik Harms of Yale. Then we'll take a break, and Mike Pante will take over, followed by Jade Lynn Roberts, University of New South Wales, and then concluding with myself and Mori Mayumi, who will be joining us in a recording. And finally, I should say, we have a new member to the group, Professor Hayashi Kengo, who you should see on the screen, not presenting today because I didn't want to twist his arm, but doing extraordinary work on the history of settlement in Jakarta. So he'll be joining us in the conversation. I wanted to say one further thing, which is sort of to reiterate something Uwe said. We have participants and of course attendees from all over, from many time zones, and also from multiple internet providers. And there may be little glitches along the way, so please bear with us. With that, I guess we should get started and turn it right over to Uchi.
And Uji, I will bring your presentation up. And while we do that, I would just like to share with everyone that we will be making 3 consecutive presentations, and then we will have discussion. And in the meantime, please share any of the questions that you have, either through the chat function or the Q&A function. Either is fine. And with that, Uji, take it away.
Yes, yeah, that is correct. Okay. Okay. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me in this conference. My name is Uji Nugroho, and I am from History Department, Gajah Mada University, Yogyakarta. My presentation titled Gotong Royong and the Transformation of Kampung Ledok Jode, Yogyakarta. I'll start with introducing, next slide, please. I'll start with introducing what Gotong Royong is. You can see in the can you move to the next slide? Okay. Gotong Royong is a popular term in Indonesia as well as in Malay that could be described in many ways, but the main idea equivalent with sharing burden with the community. It is also regarded as a social practices based on reciprocal exchange, but that's also Kampung spirit. Previous slide, please. Sorry. Some studies show us that Gotong Royong, still in the very beginning. The state practice, some studies show us that Gotong Royong is the state practices to shape and engineer the society toward its own end. It is a mechanism orchestrated by the authorities to mobilize the masses, rooted from the corvée or forced labor in the feudal society in the colonial as well as in the colonial era. On the other hand, it's also kind of social, there's also a popular strategy through which community negotiate their position and right by engaging in the state agendas. Regarding the informal settlement transformation, many believe that several external factors can influence the transformation of a slum into an ordinary settlement, including the important role of branch of the state, non-government organization, university, and devoted individual. Yet overemphasis on this factor might hide the inner capacity of the community to empower themselves. This presentation briefly chronicles the historical transformation of Kampung Ledok Jode in Yogyakarta from what Indonesian commonly call as Kampung Kumuh or slum to what is now called as ordinary kampung. It's aimed to understand how neighborhood, voluntarism, and outside support reinforce each other to bring about a change. The locus of the study is a riverbank community living in RT 18 RW4 Kampung Ledok Jode, Yogyakarta, on the east bank of Jode River, which flows through central Yogyakarta. This kampung is a typical riverside community in Yogyakarta, but smaller in terms of populations, with a total about 107 inhabitants. Also considered an informal settlement, the area located in the center of town, encircled by the modernity of urban Yogyakarta. Apart from Kampung Jode itself, the district also contains a former colonial housing estate called Kota Baru or Newwick. which one symbolized a bulwark against indigenization, as you can see in the picture. Next slide, please. Okay, okay, please skip this part. Next slide. This kampung is located below the level of surrounding street from which only a small gate is visible, hinting the presence of the neighborhood below. The gate is also only access to the riverbank settlement, and the narrow alley connect the whole neighborhood. There are 33 small houses. It's less than 21 square meters, constructed of mix of material including brick, bamboo, wood, and hosting about 64 households. Although the settlement used to be viewed as integrated part of Chode River slum, this community actually had certain distinctive feature. At the beginning, it is of existence. It was very small settlement that was relatively detached from other riverside community, and outside connection were fragile. Compared to the other riverbank settlement in the vicinity of the Chode rivers, the neighborhood was occupied recently, whereas the existence of other Chode riverbank informal settlement can be dated back in the 1960s or even earlier. The Ledok Chode neighborhood emerged in the late 1970s. It represents the further step of expansion of the riverbank settlement in Yogyakarta that had begun in the time of Indonesian War of Independence. In the late 1940s, Yogyakarta became the capital of Republic Indonesia and home about 50,000 refugees from elsewhere in the country. Prior to that period, the riverbank population was still sparse, and folktales describe the area as the home of ghouls. Accompanying the growth of the city in the earlier years of Indonesian independence, the population along Chode gradually increased, mostly comprising people commonly known as gelandangan, from homeless quarters. They occupy empty house left by owner who fled due to the war, empty land, a Chinese graveyard, and sandbank under the Gondolayu Bridge that crosses the Chode rivers. From that time, the area became famous as a center city slum. From the Gondolayu Bridge, the process of peopling the Chode River bank expanded to the north in the direction of what is today called as Kampung Ledok Chode. The Ledok Chode community began to emerge. Next slide, please. The Ledok Chode community began to emerge when several men from various places outside the Yogyakarta who came seeking for their fortune started to occupy the sandbank of the Chode. The sandbank naturally formed through stealing was unclaimed, but according to the law, it belonged to the government. Some informers recall that before the arrival of this quarter, the sandbank was cultivated with secondary crops by residents from the neighboring area. However, Pak Suryadi, one of the first residents of Kampung Ledok Chode, who still remains, stated that at the time of his arrival, the area was still covered with bamboo and trees. Although living in the riverbank was considered inappropriate and risky, it was attractive for many people without other means. Like elsewhere, the major problem with this riverbank settlement related to its illegal status. Early residents did not have residential document or any proof to support their tenure. Consequently, those less privileges were not entitled to basic citizenship right and were outside the purview of the government service. None of them work in formal sector because of their low education, eligibility, and general public to tendency to discriminate them. Most of them work as scavenger, pedicab driver, or labor, thief, prostitute, and also beggar. Their circumstances were further complicated by several factors. This cultural trait that caused the community to face social exclusion. Commonly, this kampung was depicted as niche for criminal due to its hidden location. It was difficult to access And the Kampung Ledok become a favorite place for many criminals wanting to avoid law enforcement. Another problem was the absence of brokers such as NGO, political parties, or individual pattern, which limited their ability to form border connection with outside world. Unlike other Chode riverside community, particularly located around Kondolayu Bridge, which were incorporated into the Kampung upgrading project carried out by famous Romo Mangun project and also Yayasan Pondok Rakyat, Kampung Ledok Chode was not covered by this program. In other places, Romo Mangun brought about improvement not only by constructing better houses in the slum area, but also successfully lobbying the government to grant residents full citizenship. Some older residents described Pak Bagyo Soekarno, a member of Kondo Kusuman Church, as devoted individual who provide them with practical assistance to improve their living condition. However, Romo Mangun made use of his personal connection to the local official national leaders in Jakarta, both civil and military, to advocate on behalf of the poor. Apparently, Pak Bagyo Soekarno, who advocate people in Ledok Chode, did not play a comparable middleman role. The Ledok Chode community therefore had to struggle for recognition through different means. Next slide, please. Yeah, next. In the beginning, only 5 men took shelter in the location, especially at night, by making use of any material they found, such as bamboo, wood, cardboard from trash which they collected daily. Others rather then follow. And next, please. They can be classified into 3 main categories. Others quarter that follow. Permanent residents, seasonal habits, and sojourners. In the early 18th, about 25 households of people, mostly from rural area, had already become permanent residents. They live in semi-permanent, self-built, semi-permanent houses, and some informal describe that these semi-informal houses as constructed from curved or kedek or woven sheet of bamboo that function only to provide shelter from the rain. Since the bank was still low, the area was prone to flooding almost every time it's rained, and the house were often carried away by the water. Kampung Ledok Chode was heterogeneous. The community bond was tenuous. It's become to transform when the settler received an official recognition for their tenure status. The process started in 1983 when the settler still lived without permanent house and had not yet established any social structure. They hold celebration of Indonesian independence. This was an important Indonesian commemoration, especially under the new regime, Indonesian new regime under Suharto, in which the state attempt to mobilize the mass to cultivate the spirit of nationalism and patriotism. On the other hand, through their participation on the commemoration, the people expressed their sense of belonging and expectation to be treated like part of the nation. During the celebration, Ledok Chode settler invited the sub-district chief, or locally called as Pak Camat, and other government representatives to pay a visit to their kampung. It was the very first time that the authorities came to the riverbank community with a sympathetic approach. In this regard, the commemoration of Indonesian independence was a mechanism that linked the occupant with local government apparatus to win their sympathy. It was also stages of negotiation by which, through their participation in national ceremony, the settler in Ledok Chode claimed tacit recognition for their existence. At the same time, the process showing togetherness actually glued them together as a community for the very first time. After this, they become more active in conducting various events and celebrations such as Natal or Christmas and Lebaran or Eid al-Fitr and any national commemoration. Since 2015, Kampung Ledok Chode has become a famous tourist attraction for its December Lantern Festival, which has attracted a significant number of visitors. lantern, which give light up the dark to create an enjoyable nighttime ambience, were chosen to call attention to the fact that the settlement had left its dark past behind and has transformed into an ordinary kampung. People in Kampung Ledok Chode reverse Gotong Royong in two sense, either as collective spirit of communality or as a social practices. Gotong Royong as a collective spirit began to spark when people become more dependent on the location and composition of the occupant of the group stabilized. With this, it's become possible for the settlers to pursue common initiative. And in the beginning, Gotong Royong required more just expression of commitment. It also involves some level of coercion. Sorry. Certain prominent figures who were able to exercise power over the rest played an important role in establishing mutual cooperation. Since the kampung had no structure, some figures who were able to assume power because of their seniority, their broader network, or their courage as jago or tough men emerged as an informal leader. The sesepuh or elder member of this kampung apprised others that he permitted all newcomers from various occupation or background to settle. But one thing that they have to apply to follow regulation, such as maintaining order and performing mutual aid. Sorry. Gotong Royong as social practice can be understood as both mutual help among neighbor or communal service for public work. In the early 80s, Gotong Royong as a practice was introduced in the form of walking bee or kerja bakti to renovate the settlement based on their own initiative. This marked an important shift from previous era when the lack of sense of community caused residents to act selflessly. In 86, Mount Merapi erupted, causing tons of sand and other material to flow into the Chode River. The river still up and narrow the riverbed caused when flood every rainy season. Some inhabitants left the area as they had other options, but those who remained started to fix the kampung by performing series of communal services, which were conducted daily. They also learned at the time how to mitigate flood and to prepare for evacuation. Since this period, the kampung renovation mutual work has become their daily routine. The improvement carried more attention from outside beginning in early 90s. An important breakthrough occurred in 1992 when Universitas Kristen Duta Wacana, a Catholic private university in Yogyakarta, carried a program to redesign kampung spatial arrangement and constructed 25 houses to shelter residents along the several public facilities. I will shorten my presentation by saying that the Gotong Royong that materialized in the form of cooperation between the community and outside supporters spurred the improvement of physical condition. To some extent, it's also lift up the social status of Kampung Ledok Chode inhabitant. Kampung Ledok Chode eventually gained a formal recognition with the incorporation to the settlement into the formal administrative unit or Rukun Tangga. Unfortunately, the inhabitants appear to have little knowledge about the process behind the administrative change, suggesting it happened in the top-down fashion. To conclude my presentation, I will say that in the very beginning that Kampung Ledok Chode represent a community less exposed to outside influence. Its tenuous internal bonds made it difficult to establish any regular practices or mutual aid among the population. Although with the passage of time, the kampung improvement involves a number of outside agencies, the world transformation began once the inhabitants successfully developed a sense of community. Gotong Royong emerged as the construction of collective spirit that tied the residents together and made them more committed to one another. The use of personal power or charisma inevitably helped internalize the collective sense of community. The community was also strengthened by the experience of facing threats such as eviction, disaster, as well as shares feeling of marginalization. Through certain extent, Gotong Royong became mechanism to negotiate the resident status to win the local government sympathy needed for recognition for their existence. Kampung Ledok Sode transformation demonstrated how Gotong Royong was historically constructed and shifted in parallel with the development of Kampung itself. A series of Kampung improvement programs made walking beach a community routine, an institution of the riverbank settlement as formal administrative unit gave residents a systematic and clear-cut means of community identification. This generated a further construction of Gotong Royong that gradually became institutionalized in form of Kampung ritual. In this context, Gotong Royong required the community member to participate actively or to at least be present physically in communal activity in order to make manifest their commitment to being part of the community. The use of sanction show that Gotong Royong further transformed into social institution created to regulate relation among the residents. This implied that Gotong Royong as political construction is not merely a top-down schema, but also product of the Kampung Resident Initiative. I stop at this point. Thank you very much. So, Uwe.
We're turning to Seng now. Seng, you ready to go?
Just a second. Hi everyone, thank you very much. Really happy to be talking about Singapore, in a conversation and discussion about Southeast Asian cities. By way of starting, Singapore is of course known today, for the explosion of COVID-19 cases among the migrant workers in the city-state. And a lot of the cause of this outbreak is of course due to the living conditions, specifically the sort of housing dormitories that they are living in, which has not given them due protection from the pandemic. And rightly so, I think various NGOs and even the government itself acknowledge the need to improve the housing and the living conditions. So that is a way in which we can think about how a crisis may be able to contribute to social and housing change and urban change in a better way. And that's a way for me to kind of locate what I'll be talking about with respect to the urban history of Singapore. About 60 years ago, there was a big fire at a kampung called Bukit Hosui, which destroyed an informal settlement, a kampung, and what I call an urban kampung. It was the biggest fire in Singapore history, which happened in 1961, 2 years after the government had just come to power. And 16,000 people were made homeless. The fire is remarkable in the Singapore story, not just for the scale of the fire, but for the scale of the rehousing that took place subsequently. The government bought the fire site, prevented the informal settlers, the squatters, from rebuilding their homes there, and instead built a number of emergency housing, public housing blocks on the fire site, moved most of the fire victims back to the fire site. Not just that, but also the emergency housing enabled further kampung clearance and enable the rehousing of people from the inner city in the urban renewal program, therefore totally changing the urban history of Singapore, the urban landscape of Singapore. And this has been the catalyst for subsequent economic and social change in Singapore. You know, I mean, today, you know, listening, comparing with their very interesting presentation on Jogja, it's so different in Singapore today. We could have gone the Jogja way. You know, we could have improved and developed the informal settlements, the kampungs. Instead, we have public housing, which means that the state has obtained a leading and major role in organizing housing, employment, the economy itself in Singapore. So what I want to talk about today is just some of the interviews that I conducted when I was doing this research about 15 years ago, to sort of find out the social history and the memories of people who used to live in Bukit Ho Swee and who experienced the big fire, and also the subsequent rehousing. I come up with the concept of oral history as a kind of Ashen history of Singapore, a history that is kind of gray, it's not black and white, so it is not a very linear or triumphal history of Singapore, that Singapore came from Kampung and developed into a modern housing state. The history is a lot more gray, especially if we look at the oral history, memories of people who used to live in the Kampung. It's also gray because it shows how the fire and the subsequent development of Singapore has affected actually people's memories. And this is something I want to highlight in the presentation, that while oral history is a very strong source and way to penetrate into the writing of social history, nevertheless, oral history also shows how memory can be affected by other narratives that are just as powerful as people's memory. So in a sense, there's a price that Singaporeans have paid, the older Singaporeans have paid for their citizenship and for their ownership of public housing, which is their memories are sort of shaped or even distorted in some ways, or even restricted in other ways by the official story of the fire. So what I want to do is to talk about three kind of snapshots of speeches and oral histories about the fire. So this is the first one, and I heard this at the beginning of my research. Never forget it, because the passion that went into this speech, which was quite remarkable. This is a speech given by a social welfare official at one of the relief centers for the fire victims just on the night, I think the next day after the fire. And he was talking about, you know, the burning question, really, in the aftermath of the fire. Now, if you talk to anyone about the fire today, the big question is, who did it? Who started the fire? And there were lots of rumors, even on the day itself in 1961, that the government had set the fire. So this poor social welfare officer had to go to the fire site and face the fire victims and try to persuade them otherwise. So I'll just read this. Brothers and sisters, your pains are the pains of our government. Your joy, your happiness are the joy and happiness of the government. This is the truth. So let us all face the truth together. Whoever started this fire is a heartless person who started the fire. Our government definitely did not start this fire. Who started this fire definitely would not come to this place, would not dare to come and face the truth. So the night when we knew of the fire, our Prime Minister announced that the fire was very serious. Immediately started relief work. The second day, he also told everyone to support our brothers and sisters in this Bukit Ho Swee and Tiong Bahru calamity. So he was emphasized the government so many times there, as that it's illogical to believe in the rumors that the government had committed the arson to destroy the kampong and therefore clear it for public housing. But was he successful? Was he convincing? So when I did my interviews, this is about 55 years later, 45 years later, you can see that people do remember these rumors, but were they able and willing to tell me about it? So I went to this is among the first interviews I did, and this was at a community center, which in Singapore, community centers organize activities for older Singaporeans. So I was told there was this lady I should talk to who was a fire victim. In fact, I managed to find quite a number of interviewees at the community center. And this lady was in a dancing lesson with other, people her age. And I, kind of interrupted their dance and spoke to them, told them about my research, asked them about the fire, and it seemed to go well. And then I made a mistake of asking them about the rumors that the government has set the fire. So that's what I said. But some people said the government set the fire, and there was some laughter. In the background, someone said, "It was like that last time, don't anyhow say." And the lady I was talking to, Maggie Chong, well, it's not her real name, she said, "The government, if you anyhow say, you'll be arrested. You better not say." I kind of tried to protest and persuade her. There were truly people who said this in the past. And someone in the background said last time there was eviction and people did not want to move. After a while, the fire occurred. Laughs. So what is interesting here is, of course, that Singaporeans, so many years, so decades after the event, are fearful of talking about these rumors. This is not even true at all. No one would seriously contemplate the rumors today. And also interesting is also the laughter. So there's a sense of irony and a sense of cynicism with respect to something that has happened already. And yet there was this fear still of talking seriously or even acknowledging the rumors of the fire, fear of being arrested, the warning to me and to herself. Finally, this is an interview with Thea Chuan, who was one of my first interviews as well, and someone I really enjoyed talking to. And he told me so much about the memory of the kampong and the way that the kampong was actually quite a complex place. Like in Jogja, you have Gotong Royong, you have self-help. That was in evidence in Bukit Ho Swee and other kampongs in Singapore. But in Singapore, the kampongs were also places of illegality or semi-illegal, kind of semi-illicit ways of life, the gangsters, the hawking, the moonshining, and so on. So he gave me a very nuanced story about the fire. Now, would he be able to talk to me about the arson? So I asked him, about the rumors. And he said, according to my knowledge, the fire started in Tiong Bahru. I heard from some friends who live in Tiong Bahru, it started from a bun seller's house. So this is one of the alternative theories about how the fire started. That it was someone cooking and, there was an accident and the fire was not tended and therefore it started. So the blame therefore is on the people living in Bukit Ho Swee, and maybe they were careless and negligent. So I tried to engage him and I said, but we do not know how the fire started. I find it strange that the Chinese newspapers reported people witnessing someone setting the fire, yet there was no final report on the results of the police or official investigation. And he said, and his explanation is quite interesting, that this problem is sometimes rather difficult to solve. I mean, you require evidence for such things. Even if there were witness, it's useless without evidence. Singapore is all about law. Unless you saw it at the scene and caught them, then it's evidence. If not, no. You know, and I want to kind of end off with this sense of being reasonable. You know, Thea Chuan is being really reasonable about complex and difficult and unresolved questions in Singapore's urban history. And he doesn't deny the possibility, but he doesn't want to commit in other or talk about the rumors. What he wants to do is to provide the context today, and there's a way in which we can see what is the nature of citizenship in Singapore, that being a Singaporean today does influence and does shape or even restrict your memory and your oral histories in some way. So the fire, in conclusion, has had a big impact on the urban history of Singapore. It also has a great effect on people's memories and their willingness, their ability to talk about their own histories. So thank you. I'll be happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Kasam. It's great. If you could unshare your screen. Thank you. And Erik, you should be able to share your screen once Kasam, yes.
1 second.
No problem.
Okay. Okay, got it.
There. Thank you. Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Erik, you should be good to go.
Okay, I'm setting up the screen share. Give me 1 second. One second. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So I'll get started. First, I want to thank Jordan and Uwe and all of my fellow panelists for this wonderful event. It's been very exciting to join a group of people who are interested in cities across Asia, especially the kind of side of these cities that's not necessarily the top-down master planned vision of everything, but to see a kind of a bottom-up way in which people inhabit and understand these cities that we're also interested in. So my talk today is called Unsettling Stories of Eviction from the New Saigon. And it builds from a long-term research project that I've been doing starting way back in about 2008. It actually carried out ethnographic research from 2010 to 2011 in a place called Tu Tiem, which you can see here on this slide. Tu Tiem is this space within the oxbow of the Saigon River. You could see, oh, sorry, excuse me. It's immediately across the Saigon River from District 1 in Ho Chi Minh City, which is the Saigon's historic core. So as you could imagine from a real estate developer's perspective, it's prime real estate. And historically it was seen as underdeveloped. In fact, many of the real estate developers would call it empty. But one of the things I discovered during my research was that Tu Tiem was the opposite of empty. It was in fact a very vibrant community. And in order to build this great vision for a master planned urban development project, it required the eviction of 14,600 households. And so when Jordan invited me into this project to talk about settling Asian cities and urban settlers, at first I thought to myself, well, actually, am I even a scholar of settlement? I tend to see myself as a scholar of displacement and people being removed from the land. But then as I started to think about my research, I actually started to think about the double meaning of this term settling and unsettling. And so the purpose of my paper today is to zoom into Tu Tiem and to talk about the dynamic relationship between settling and unsettling. So I'll talk in kind of three parts, and I want this to be a discursive talk. I'm not going to go into too much complicated theory in these things, but the core story that I want you to think about is these layers of settling and unsettling. What's first, on the first level, you can think of the double meaning of the term unsettling, that stories of eviction themselves are unsettling. When you hear people talk about the massive displacement and the movement that they have and the disruption, they are literally unsettled, the opposite of settling. And the stories that they tell are themselves unsettling. They drive you to despair in a sense, and they move you from your complacency and the feelings that you have when you look at everyday cities, right? So I want to attend to that aspect of the unsettling stories, and that's what I do in the paper that we wrote for City and Society. But I also want to talk about the ways in which one of the idioms that I started to recognize when I was returning to my interview transcripts, one of the ways in which people counter that aspect of being unsettled when people are being evicted, one of the first things they turn to describe their kind of right to the city is actually to talk about their own stories of settling. So I'll pause for a moment just to remind us about that a little bit, and the way in which a way to fight back against unsettling aspects of eviction is to talk about your own history of settlement. But as I started getting into some of those stories that I'll show you in the third part, is that some of those early stories of settling are themselves stories of displacement and unsettling as well. So what I'm interested in is this kind of large cycle of unsettling and how that's entangled with all of these histories of settlement as well. So let me just show you some unsettling images for the first part of this paper, to show you a little bit about the landscape of Tu Tiem. What we're looking here in this image that you can see is a view from Tu Tiem in towards the District 1 of Ho Chi Minh City. And so you can see this kind of dramatic contrast of this neighborhood, that what we're looking at is former neighborhoods, a mix of wetlands and neighborhoods that have been completely demolished in order to create the blank slate from which this new master plan development can be built, right? And if you'd been to this place before, knowing that there were 14,600 households scattered about in densely populated areas, but also some quasi-rural areas of this image itself is extremely unsettling to look at. And the whole purpose is to produce this. This is the master plan designed by Sasaki Associates at the request of the Ho Chi Minh City Authority. They won, an open, democratic architectural contest. And I'm hesitant to blame Sasaki, because Sasaki in some ways is doing the bidding of the Ho Chi Minh City authorities, who said basically, here's a blank, if you have a blank piece of land, what would you do and what would you design on the opposite side of the river? And in many ways, if you look at this plan itself, it has all kinds of, architecturally progressive qualities about it. It tries to integrate nature and cosmopolitan design elements, introduce elements of a walkable city, all of these kinds of things. So it's not so much the design itself in terms of its own architectural sensibilities, but it's the way in which the design itself is built upon this erasure of a pre-existing landscape. So let me just show you a couple more unsettling images. These are photographs that I took in 2010 during the time of my most intense field research. You can't necessarily see probably from your small screens where everybody's watching this, but you can see some of the elements of human habitation. Here there's a woman sitting in the front, which would have been the front patio of her modest home, surrounded by the rubble of neighbors who have been displaced. Here, this image, although it may not seem so striking to you, to me as an ethnographer, it's really quite dramatic, because these words written right here, they say "Chuk Mung Hai Ho," And that is congratulations to the two families is a sign that will normally be put up in a household immediately following a wedding. But then immediately underneath it is a graffiti in a sense that says Bangdat, and Bangdat basically means land for sale. And there's some phone numbers that you can call if you're a real estate developer prospecting in the unsettling rubble of people evicted from this zone. And I think the bottom image speaks for itself as well, right? I'll show just one more, a couple more images of this process before turning to the next part. But one thing that I want you to think about is just the unsettling nature of doing ethnography and talking to people as you travel the streets of these zones of eviction, as people are describing the radical rupture and loss of livelihood that comes with these kinds of developments. It's quite obvious, and it sometimes feels almost embarrassing to repeat it, but just the displacement from space that leads people to new neighborhoods where they have no social relations, often shunted off to dusty and underdeveloped margins of the city. In Vietnam, people often, typically working class households will have commerce out of the front of their homes, and people will develop a whole set of networks and neighborhoods which create livelihood possibilities. And then that's all radically destroyed, and people are moved off to other neighborhoods and have to reconstruct their lives, often in ways that lead to further displacement and unsettling of other people. The next image is a kind of striking image showing the ways in which people were enlisted into their own process of demolition and displacement as well. It's a very unsettling story, is my point. Now, what I want to talk about, though, the core addition, a lot of those stories that I just described, I describe in great detail in a book I wrote that's published in 2016. But what I'm trying to do that's different in this particular revisiting of some of those interviews is to think about the ways in which the storytelling act is central to the ways in which people grapple with that unsettling quality. And one of the things that I'll show in a couple of these pictures that you'll see here is that in the rubble of displacement, one thing that was very interesting to see was the way in which all of these kind of places of congregation would pop up in the rubble. So this image that you're looking here is a cafe, an impromptu cafe, and all of these people who are hanging out in this cafe are actually people who've been evicted from the zone. And many of these people are close friends of mine who I came to know during a year of field research and several years of follow-up research as well. And what was so striking is that even as their homes are being demolished and people are moved off to different neighborhoods, they would come back in the morning on an almost daily basis, sometimes because their work was in downtown Saigon and they had to pass through this area anyhow. And what would they talk about? They would talk about everyday life and all these kinds of things. And it was very different from what you expect, when you read about eviction, the public discourses of eviction tend to be people, marching in the streets, sending out, protest letters and petitions and those kinds of things. But what they were doing was they were coming together as a community to recreate those kind of bonds of sociality that were destroyed basically by the eviction process. And when they would talk, especially to an ethnographer who's asking about this neighborhood, they would often tell these stories of their own families and the history in these particular communities. But before I get to that, I just want to kind of show some more images of this kind of spontaneous return that you would see in these neighborhoods, right? Here's another image of the rubble cafe. These tented homes here are actually the remains of what were formerly full homes. If you look carefully at some of the images, you can see that there's tile floors underneath those tarpaulins that have been spread over. These are families that were evicted, and then once they went to the new area, realized they could not really make a livelihood in the new area, so then returned quite literally to the living room of their former home. But I want to switch gears just a little bit, and I want to play a little, I hope you can hear this song.
Người xưa đâu mô đất cao này mọc lên thành tiền, luồng lúa đầu nay thấy chẳng trùng cư nó mọc ra đây, thấy chưa, một cái thời trâu bò rồi nay nó già nua, có khô rôm khô đầu mà không. Đấy, là đứng đây, con trâu con bò mà nó già rồi không phải gì giờ.
I just played that short clip. This is a 75-year-old man, Bakhai, who I call, that just means uncle number 2, who's singing this song. And I remember sitting in the Rubble Cafe you saw pictures of earlier, and he broke into this song, and it really struck me. And as he sang the song, everyone's head was kind of nodding, and I knew it was a kind of important ethnographic moment in a sense, right? And so I went back to translate the song, and I started asking around if people had heard the song before, because he told me that he made the lines himself, but it turns out that the tune of the song was actually a famous song from the 1960s that was really popular during the Vietnam War era. And he had changed the words a little bit to have this kind of meaning about displacement, you know, the rise of these apartment buildings, transforming tombs and money. And, you know, this is essentially the tombs of the ancestors are being replaced by real estate profit in a sense, right? But the thing that struck me and what kind of prompted this idea about the connection between settlement and unsettling is that this song that he had changed the lyrics to was actually a song. The lyrics of that song itself were sung by a famous Cham, ethnic Cham, Vietnamese Cham singer in the 1960s. And the song itself is about the displacement of the Cham civilization of Vijaya in the 15th century by the Vietnamese. And it was the strangest thing in trying to imagine how Vietnamese in the 1960s would latch onto a song about a civilization which their own civilization had displaced. But the meaning of that song had a certain resonance during the Vietnam War period because Southern Vietnamese were also worried about becoming displaced by Northern Vietnamese Viet Minh and the Vietnamese communist Red Peril that they were also afraid of during that time. So there's this way in which the story of one displacement becomes the icon and the anthem of a particular people at a certain time fearing displacement of their own, and resonates with the kind of Southern sense of difference from Northern Vietnamese. So then, as I was thinking about this too, I started going back to some of the interviews, and this leads me to the second, or the final part of my presentation today, if I can. Sorry. Here's another image of, you know, how people set up these chairs to hang out and come back and gather within the rubble. Here's another rubble cafe where these stories are being told, right? But this last part, what I wanted to get to is the way in which the story of settling that a lot of people would tell in order to describe the injustice of their own displacement was founded on a classic Vietnamese narrative structure called Khai Phá. And Khai Phá, people who speak Chinese will also know there's a kind of parallel to Chinese. It's a notion of clearing the land, right? Clearing wasteland. And part of the Vietnamese story of civilizing the southern lands is a long kind of manifest destiny story of clearing the wastelands of the south as northern Vietnamese move into the south and brings Vietnamese civilization and displace the Khmer and displace the Cham and displace ethnic minorities to create Vietnamese civilization. But as people were telling the story of their own settling as a way to fight back against their own displacement by contemporary real estate developers, they would tell the same story of Khai Phá as a justification for their own occupation of the land. So I don't have the audio of this, but let me just read you Here's the boat captain. That's why there was a picture of a boat just a second ago. I'll show you that boat. This is the boat captain's boat. And he says, I went up there to the authorities and I asked, motherfucker, why are you forcing me out? I know that the houses of some of the others, well, motherfucker, they are expensive, super expensive. And so people there grit their teeth and accept it. But here in Tutium, the things is we are weak in this, because in the old days when people were living here, they were only here during the wartime. And during that time, the land was left by their parents and grandparents. And they cleared the land and they lived on it. Người ta cài phá, người ta ở. Do you understand? And this is the classic kind of civilizing narrative of claiming land through land clearance. And then I'll show you one more before I close, just to close this. This is a teacher who talked about it in explicit terms about this displacement of the Khmer. Teacher Long was very well respected in this neighborhood. Whenever I wanted to learn about eviction, they said, go see Teacher Long, he'll tell you the story. And he says, my great-grandfather was one of the first people to clear the land, Khai Phá, in Thủ Thiêm. My great-grandfather was a village headman there, so that's how it was. One of the first people to clear the land in Thủ Thiêm. Yes, it was so. He was one of those kinds of people. But one of the features of the Thủ Thiêm area was that it also had a lot of land named after foreign people. Most of them were Khmer, Người Miền. The Khmers had their name on the land there in that area. I'm not so good at remembering clearly the names of some of those people, but the land was a wasteland of silt deposits. And you see this equation of Khmer lands with a wasteland that can only be civilized by the arrival of the Vietnamese. And so I'll turn to my last slide. This is just a quote from the paper to give you a sense of, hopefully to tie it all together. But the story that I want to tell is the way in which settling and unsettling are tied and locked into this kind of long dance, you might say, where layers of unsettling are layered upon each other. And so there's a painful irony here. These markers of a time of settlement are themselves reminders of how the landscape itself was once usurped by Vietnamese settlement into southern lands. When I call this a double displacement, it's not only because the displacement has occurred more than once, but because the story of displacement is itself an act of displacement. That is, one story of displacement displaces and obscures another. And I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erik.
Great.
And if you could...
Here we are back together.
Great.
Well, at this point, we're sort of right on time and have a good bit of time for Q&A, and then we'll take a brief break before the second group of papers. Uwe, do you want to take over?
Yes, can you hear me? Great. So let's start with the first question, which is really a great one to start with, and that is really about the research methodology that each of you have used to collect and gather oral histories. And Kaseng, let's start with you. Could you share a little bit more about how you prepare for the collection of these stories? And then more specifically, can you share how you've prepared to translate across time or language and or organize those challenges into your methodology? And after your response, let's hear from Uji and then from Erik as well.
Thanks for the question. Well, as you can see from some of the extracts that I used, I didn't prepare for a lot of the interviews very well, especially the one with regards to the rumors of arson. So I in the beginning, I always made the mistake, I asked the question early and it was too early, and people then become quite wary of speaking about the rumors, or even the interview itself, memory of the kampong and the fire itself. So I learned, in some ways, I learned to do it better, as time went along. For example, to move that question to the end of the interview instead. Otherwise, I guess the interview questions were mostly to try to tease out how kampong life was like, and to find out about the changes that happened after the fire. One of my regrets is not being able to interview people who were older at the time, or even middle-aged at the time of the fire. They had all passed on. So I had to supplement my interviews with other interviews that were conducted by the National Archives earlier on in the 1980s and 1990s. So those were useful. Most of the interviews were with Chinese, Hokkien speakers. That was the demographic of the kampong. So that, based on the research that I did beforehand, I tried to get a hold of people of different demographics, economic characteristics. If someone could speak English, that also reflects on their economic status. And I think I'll just end by saying it was really interesting to interview people who were maybe in their 60s at the time. These were children at the time of the fire. But something I learned about the interviews was that a child in the kampong is different from a child today in a contemporary period. There was a lot more local knowledge. There was a lot more wisdom, kind of street wisdom. And the memories of that period were really, really strong and very insightful for me. Thanks.
That's great. Uji?
Thank you for the question. It's quite embarrassing that I'm not I don't have a very organized preparation for the presentation, because I just came there and I bring some interview guide. And second thing is that my topic is quite general. So people only telling the general history of their kampung. So nothing really sensitive. But what I learned from conducting interview in the neighborhood is that language play importantly. We spoke in many languages, but at least 2, Indonesian language and Javanese language. In Javanese language, we have at least 3 levels of language, which just show us our position in front among the other. But it also means the closeness between the interviewer and the interviewee. And somehow they will very open when I treat them like a friend. So they will say everything that they want. Secondly, I think it is maybe gender bias or something, but I found that some women, even they are older in the community, inclined to say that I don't know that part because I'm just a woman. You can ask or somebody which is man, senior member of the kampung which is man, and what he say, it could be correct because I'm only working on the domestic thing on my house, so I don't really know about the situation. But it is not to generalize, but I find some women said so. The third thing what I learned is the location, because they live in very densely populated neighborhood. Each of houses wall connected each other, so the voice could be heard from other houses. So I found several conversation was interrupted by somebody behind the wall. Even she or he corrected the information even by my informant. So when he mentioned about the years, and it's mistakenly wrongly said about the years, somebody beyond the wall correct him because they live in a very densely populated location. There's several points that I can make for now. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Um, I'll be honest, I don't consider myself an oral historian per se. I consider myself to be an ethnographer, which the distinction is that I see myself as engaging in a kind of long-term pursuit of simple stories. I'll never show up with a interview schema or a list of questions. Oftentimes, if I want to learn about somebody who has experienced eviction, for example, usually that entails spending full days, weeks, doing all kinds of random things that are not even related to eviction. It means going and sitting all day at a house, helping out, doing random things, eating meals with people, helping cook the meals and those kinds of things. And what you tend to do is you learn that the story of an eviction is part of the total story of a human life in a sense, right? And then it'll come in at these moments, right? But if you show up to a house and you say, like, tell me about your eviction, you'll get very specific kinds of responses, often kind of canned responses that are like speaking to a journalist or something. And I don't have a problem with journalists, by the way. I think they do a lot of important work, right? But the nature of a conversation as it comes out is very different. If you're hanging out with a bunch of people all day long and then they start complaining about land prices or something like that amongst themselves, and they start telling you, and then you can ask, you say, this is interesting, and you can not, because you don't know about it, that it's a very organic discussion. They explain it to you because you don't know about it, right? Now, that said, it doesn't solve every ethical dilemma or the kind of the identity politics that come in, right? Because as a foreign researcher in Vietnam, of course, people have certain expectations and understandings of who you are and what you want to hear, all these kinds of things, right? And the best way to deal with that is to engage in, I think, what I call ethnographic sincerity. That means that you're not just there to get the answer to a preconceived question, but you're there to allow people to tell you what the questions are to begin with sometimes. And it can be you kind of have to renounce yourself a little bit. Like, for example, sometimes you get tired, you feel like you want to call it a day. And people say, well, no, actually, we're going to go off and do something. And you follow other people's projects and programs and daily agendas and all those kinds of things in ways that are serendipitous and unexpected. And then over time, people start to introduce you to others, and they kind of get the sense of what you're doing, and get involved and excited about it. I always feel that if people aren't actually interested in telling you the stories, then maybe you should leave. It's not really worth the project. I've generally found that people really like to talk about these kinds of things, though. But I don't want to talk too long because I know we have a lot of questions, but I could talk about this for a really long time.
No, and Erik, thank you, because you've already started to address this next question, which is really about how you present yourself and your identity to the people that you're speaking with, and the extent to which the introduction of your own identity shapes the stories that you get in response. And you've already started to talk about that. Erik, why don't you share an additional quick reflection, and then we'll ask Uji and Kaisana.
Well, there's a couple things that I'll say. So one, it's very important in all ethnographic or scholarly research to be completely transparent, right? This is not secretive, everything one does as a scholar. So in Vietnam, there's a tradition of using name cards, so you show up and you say, here's my card, and even people in very, people who aren't formally professionals often have little name cards that they'll give you too, right? You say, I'm a professor, I study these processes, but then you don't just immediately stop there and then go directly and all you do is talk. You you stay and you linger and you talk to people about what they're interested in. And it's central to the whole process, I think. And the identity, but I will say that every once in a while, you know, you mix it up a little bit too. Sometimes I'll spend a whole day for a month long, every single day, 24 hours a day, basically for a month hanging out with people. But then I'll have a friend, a colleague, say like an anthropologist who works for the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Vietnam, who is a Vietnamese anthropologist, and he'll show up and hang out with me and my friends in these research areas, and the dynamic will change, right? And so this is, and you attend to that, and sometimes they'll talk about different issues, and then you build from that. There's also gender dynamics. It's not just whether you're foreign or local, but the ways in which the kinds of stories people will tell will shift according to that. So you just have to be constantly cognizant of it and recognize that you'll never solve every dilemma, but it's kind of like an artisanal practice, I would say, that you keep trying to approach in many different facets.
That's great. Uji? Uji, can you hear us? You have to unmute.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. Reflecting from it is truly different story with me because I don't have they view me as the same with the community. I came from the same relatively same town, speak their own language, and know a little bit about their historical background. So to a certain extent, I just want to say something quite different when I was there with Jordan. So I need to introduce Jordan to the people. He came from America and the like. But I have to say that the response quite different when I introduced Jordan as an American professor in the neighborhood, and they start to reveal what they really want. I can sense the thing. Initially, when I was there, they say everything in general, but then after Jordan was there, they even expected something from Jordan. If you remember Jordan, we went to Puppet Master in Badran, and they even invite us, just for the first meeting, they invite us to come to his house, and he performed wayang there. So I think somehow how we identify ourselves bring something also different. I mean, different response from our from the people.
I want to interrupt and just add here. I want to put in a word for the helicopter anthropologist for a moment. The kind of deep participant observer work that Erik and others in this group also have done is extraordinary and can't be replicated. But there's also something, a kind of chemistry that happens that Uji was just describing when you have simply put, an insider-outsider combination. And so Uji could use me to talk to people, and they thought that they were doing something important by talking to me as this guest, as this strange presence we call marebito in Japanese. And yet there was Uji, who's very knowledgeable and very local and approachable to them. And I found, in certainly a different way, Jade is that local in Yangon, and so I felt like some of the same dynamic is there. As Erik was just saying, bringing in somebody very different alters dynamics in an interesting way. I found repeatedly it did something quite extraordinary, and I felt very, very, I felt like I was receiving a great gift that people wanted to open up, but I think that they were just genuinely very, very curious that these people were there and then able to communicate. Pardon.
Seng? You're on mute.
Being an
Yep.
academic in Singapore helps. So that gives a certain gravity to the interview, and if the interviewer was someone from the state or from the media, that might elicit a different kind of response or more restricted response. There was one aspect of the identity thing which was quite obvious to me and quite significant to me, and that was the fact that I was a young person at the time. So to them, I was young, and then in many of the interviews, there's a certain dynamic where the interview sometimes becomes like a lecture. You know, like my life was so hard then, your life is so easy now, you know, your age group. And that's part of also the social and political discourse in Singapore. In a way, the person I was interviewing almost takes the role as the government or as the paternal figure to tell me about the lecture of, to tell me about the history of Singapore. And sometimes it just pisses me off. There was one time when I really got quite worked up inside. You know, in the end, I never said anything. But the good thing about that is that this makes elderly people quite willing to talk about their memories. It helps to take away some of their reservations, some of their you can call it censorship when it comes to telling the personal histories of Singapore that go beyond the Singapore story. Not so much with the arson thing, but to talk about more intimate things and the things that happen in people's lives. So I've learned how to deal with that and to kind of work that to my advantage. Of course, this was 15 years ago, so I'm no longer young, and I don't think I can pull this off much longer.
That's wonderful. So this is a nice progression. We'll end on this question, and that is, from the perspective of process, and once you've dealt with the issue of identity, what are you giving to the people that you are interviewing? What is the contribution to the stakeholders that you are engaging? And I'll just leave that open for anyone to start to respond to.
I'll say just a brief couple words. Well, in the particular case of Tu Tien that I was working in, people often saw me as a voice to share the stories of eviction. Like I said, there's a very powerful language that group of 14,600 households, and those are households. There's, actually 60,000 people, individual people, right? Every household has more than one person, obviously, right? And for urban planners to come in and say, oh, this is an empty area that needs to be developed, is just a complete disaster to people's lives, right? And so for someone across the world to come over, and Vietnam has a very delicate political situation. This is a national level project. Government's embarrassed that they're not actually making progress. They're comparing themselves to China, and they're not doing so good in achieving the project. So they want to push forward even further. And the voices of people resisting is a problem, right? So that there's somebody who's actually interested in the stories and like telling not just a story of eviction, but like taking their lives seriously was really quite powerful. But there's a second side to that, which is more challenging on a personal level, in that I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a politician. I'm not a Vietnamese citizen. I can't do anything to change Vietnamese politics on a pragmatic, actual level. So telling the story isn't necessarily going to win the victory for their home. The place has been totally wiped out and demolished. All of those people have been evicted, right? But there's now a book about their stories, and I made it an open access book. I got grant funding to do that so that it can be available. And then later, excerpts from the book were published in Vietnamese newspapers, telling the story of eviction in a kind of, it gave sort of scientific credibility to these stories. You know, a Yale professor has agreed that this is a violation of people's livelihoods and these kinds of things. It's a small part to play, and I don't think I'll ever feel like I've done enough in this particular situation. But I got the sense that people really, you know, I would show up and people would really talk about their stories. And then people would say, here, get on my motorbike. I want to drive you over to my friend's house because she wants to tell a story too, you know. And actually doing ethnography in this area was sort of, although heart-wrenching in terms of actually gaining access, it was some of the easiest I've ever done because people would literally drive me around and take me to the other people. And the kind of natural social scientists would call it a snowball method, but it was really like get on the back of a motorbike and people drive you to each other's houses method. So I think there's something to be said about that. But I'll stop there.
Okay. Uji?
Yeah, very little aspect. What I'm thinking is that it might not practically useful for them. It might not. But I think producing narrative is something which is quite important to the marginalized community or people like this. But I'm still on the process, so I cannot see the end and what the result. But I also want to reverse Erik's statement that in some part, especially in Taman Sari, I think my present, especially when Jordan with me, become kind of elevated social status and also charisma of our contact person there. So he can not impose, but he can offer others several alternatives that came from his own way of thinking by referring that I met UGM teacher and also a professor in America. Though we speak not on that particular issue, but I think he also made use of us, our present, to legitimate his thought upon the society. The good thing is that he really want, especially in Taman Sari, I think is really want us to voice their story because it is uncovered with meta-narrative produced by not only the authority, but the traditional authority. And the Kampung has their own story itself. And I think is really want us to voice the story of the Kampung from the people narratives. I'll stop at this point.
That's great. Kaseng, can you close us out?
Yeah. I don't have Erik's excuse because I live in Singapore and Uji is also going to Amsterdam. I don't go back to the community, actually. I rarely go back to the community. I did go back a couple of times to follow up, but I don't actually believe in the argument about giving back to the community, at least in a kind of practical or more involved way in terms of community work. But I would say that memory work itself is a way of giving back to the community. You know, the ability, the act of being able to talk about your history, which I've tried to emphasize is so important and so contested in Singapore, is a way in which we can bring some personal benefit and also on a more social level, a bigger benefit to the Singapore society as well. Sometimes I wonder, you know, if I do an interview people seem to be happy to talk about the past. Sometimes they are sad to talk about it. Is there any lasting effect or longer term effect on how they see themselves and how they use the past to create or recreate their present day identity and their place in Singapore? I don't know those questions, so I don't go back and follow that up. But I think by giving them that opportunity, that act of being able to talk about their past, even if some of the stories are not the official stories, that would at least help them to be more open and to be more creative in talking about their histories in future.
Great, thank you so much. I would like to thank each of you. What a wonderful way to start, and what a fascinating conversation. What I would like to do now is propose that we take a 10-minute break. It's 10:40 right now. Let's take a 10-minute break to stretch, to get the blood flowing, and we will start up again at 10:50 sharp.